pleasure to welcome you to the third in our series, Brama Talks, which is a monthly webinar series sponsored by Brama Grodzka Theater NN about all things Jewish Lublin, as well as the work of Brama Grodzka. Today's offering is called Future Imperfect, Dreams of Lublin Yiddishists. And we're going to be exploring the diversity of pre-war Jewish Lublin with a particular focus on secular initiatives, culminating in an exploration of Peretz House. And all of this will become illuminated during our hour together. I want to thank the Jewish Festival, which is our sponsor for today's event. It was organized in cooperation with the National Center for Culture. Just in case you're interested, all the other events are in Polish. So if you don't speak Polish, this is your event. Before I introduce our featured guest today, Piotr Nazaruk, I want to remind you about our format. So what we do is we have a conversation for 45 minutes, and then the last 15 minutes approximately, we open it up for questions from you, the audience. And the way you submit a question is through the Q&A tab. You should see on the right side of your screen a chat. It may say chat or public, and then Q&A mode. So questions go in the Q&A mode. The chat is for, you can say hello to each other, where you're viewing us from, what your connection or interest in Jewish Lublin is. And, it would be very interesting for us also to hear how you heard about Brama Talks. But now, without further ado, I want to welcome Piotr Nazaruk. Piotr is an educator, researcher. Hi, Piotr.
Hello.
And a curator of temporary exhibitions at Brama Grodzka. And he is a self-described Yiddish enthusiast and also a very prolific writer, I should say. In 2017 and 2018, he was the recipient of fellowships, and he studied at YIVO in New York at the Uriel Weinreich program in Yiddish language, culture, and literature. So, Piotr, to start out, I wanted to ask you to sort of give us the lay of the land about the diversity that existed in pre-war Jewish Lublin, because I know from myself bringing people on Bridge to Poland trips, people are often surprised to discover this diversity because we use this term Polish Jews as if that's one thing, but it's not. So could you give us a sense from a political perspective, religious, linguistic, how was this community diverse?
Well, of course, but first of all, I would like to say hello to everyone. I'm extremely excited to be here with you. And well, to answer your question, Leora, I think I need to go back to the year 1815. This is the year when in Lublin, in Szeroka Street, a very famous person whose name was Yakov Horowitz, but was better known as the seer of Lublin, or HaChoze mi Lublin in Hebrew, died in Lublin. So HaChoze or Horowitz, or the seer of Lublin, or Widzący z Lublina, as we call him in Polish, was a very influential, very important Hasidic tzaddik, right? He was one of the founders of the Hasidic movement. And when he dies in the year 1815, Hasidism is triumphing, is extremely powerful movement, is the main, the main current within Jewish community. But the fact is, oh, the screen is frozen. I see a...
Oh no, I can still hear you.
So, but we have to remember that even though the Hasidic movement started as a very revolutionary movement, like it changed a lot in terms of Jewish religion, but also the way how Jewish communities functioned. In time, it turned into very oppressive, very fundamentalistic religious movement. So I would like to show you not this image. I would like to show you the grave of the seer of Lublin, the grave of the famous Hasidic tzaddik, and we have to remember that Hasidism rose like a strong opposition rose against the Hasidic movement in time because it was so religiously and socially oppressive. So a very important movement appeared on the Jewish map in the late 18th century, in the early 19th century, the so-called Haskalah movement, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, which was aimed to like absorb European philosophy, European science, European way of organizing nations, etc. And
can I just ask you, before Haskalah, what percentage do you know of Jews in Lublin would have been classified as Hasidic?
Most of them. It's like Hasidism was a dominant form of Judaism in areas of former Poland and well, today's Poland, today's Ukraine. Only the area of the former Grand Duchy of Lithuania, so present-day Lithuania, Latvia maybe a bit, but most of all Belarus, were areas not touched by the Hasidism for many reasons. But the vast majority of Jews living in places like Lublin, Warsaw, were Hasids. But the Haskalah movement, it was not like strong in numbers, but it was strong because its followers usually were very educated, well-educated, very influential people, like the one who you can see one of a very prominent maskils, the followers of the Haskalah movement. His name was Najmanowicz. He was a Lublin maskil, a writer, a Yiddish writer, but also a Hebrew writer. And this is a very important thing we have to note, that the maskils, the followers of the Haskalah, were the first people who came up with this idea of reviving the Hebrew language as a spoken language, not a language of the Bible, not a language of religion, but a language in which you can express well, daily issues. But the Haskalah movement and also the assimilation movement, which was somehow connected with the Haskalah. Assimilation is, of course, it means like there were Jews who decided that the way to emancipate themselves, the way to emancipate the Jewish nation, the Jewish communities, is to emulate Germans, Poles, Russians, to become members of those nations.
So renouncing their Judaism or keeping their Judaism?
Keeping their Judaism, but renouncing many customs and traditions that were seen as customs that were hindering the emancipation of Jews. So unfortunately for the Haskalah followers and for the followers of the assimilation movement, they failed. Like, masses of Jews were not interested in either becoming Poles, Germans, Russians, or any other members of any other nation. And they were also not interested in giving up their way of life. So new currents, new movements within Jewish communities appeared. Most influential and important of them were the Zionism and Yiddishism. So here you can see a cover, the cover of the famous book by Theodor Herzl, one of the founders of Zionism, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. So Herzl said something revolutionary. He said, "We, the Jews, are a nation." It was these words were extremely revolutionary back then. So a nation needs a language. Herzl was not in favor of any particular language, from what I remember. He was not in favor of Hebrew nor German. In his opinion, the Jews should adopt the language, the most popular, the most efficient language. He never picked any, but following Zionism, of course, preferred the Hebrew language. But it's also important to note that the language of Zionism was also the Polish language. So we are a nation. We have a language, or we will adopt a language that will unite us. And Herzl also said that we, the Jews, needed a state. Every nation has a state, so we also need a state. In Eretz Israel, maybe in other part of the world. The world is huge. However, everyone was, of course, satisfied with the solution given by Herzl. There were Jews in Poland and other Eastern Central European countries saying that, yes, we agree, we are a nation. We have a language, and the language is not Hebrew, but Yiddish, a language we have been using for 1,000 years, a language of our fathers, mothers, our culture. And we don't need to adopt Hebrew because, well, it is a part of our tradition, of course. It's a very important language of our history, but we have a language that we wish to develop further, and we wish to develop culture based on the Yiddish language further. And we don't need to build a country, a Jewish country, somewhere in the world, because we have home here, in places we live, in Poland, in Germany, in Ukraine, in Belarus. This is our home. We live here, we have been living here for almost as long as the Slavic people do, or the Germans do. So we have every right to consider this place our home, and we should develop our communities here, in places we live. So the political movement affiliated with that way of thinking was, of course, the Bund, also the People's Party. It was a smaller party sharing somehow similar ideology. Here in the presentation, you can see a photo showing the first committee of the Bund in Lublin. It's important to note that the Bund in Poland was established in Lublin, here in the city of Lublin. I think it was in 1917, from what I remember. So the Bund was always deeply rooted in Lublin. So often when people are visiting Brama Grodzka, of course, these days it's impossible because of the coronavirus, they often ask me and other guides, can you tell us something about Polish-Jewish relations before the Second World War in Lublin? And of course, it's a very interesting question, but I always answer them that even more interesting question and more important question is, can you tell us something about Jewish relations in Lublin in the interwar period? Because the Jewish community was, in the interwar period, it was not a monolith. It was extremely diverse. Of course, there was still a religious component, Hasidic and Orthodox component, but the secular component was extremely diverse. And they were fighting with each other. They were arguing because the stakes of their arguments were extremely high, and the stakes were questions about the Jewish identity, who we are. Are we a nation? Are we an ethnic group? Are we a religious minority? Should we emigrate? Should we stay? Should we cooperate with the Poles, or maybe we should just leave and start a new life? So here I have a fragment of a map showing a fragment of Lublin, Lubartowska Street and the Czwartek Hill. And as you can see, I marked 3 buildings with red color. The one with letter A is the Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, established by Hasidic and Neo-Orthodox communities. Letter B stands for the Jewish hospital, established by the followers of Haskalah and assimilation movements in the middle 19th century. And C is Peretz House, a building that was built by Bundists and other Yiddishists in the late 1930s. So 1 neighborhood and 3 buildings representing 3 very different political currents, ideologies within the Jewish community.
And all of those buildings are still standing, correct?
They are still standing. All of them survived the war. Yes.
So when the coronavirus is over and people visit Lublin, they can see these places?
Of course they can.
Okay. So what about the linguistic, I know, for example, from my personal family experience that my grandfather insisted that they speak Polish at home. Like how many people, Jewish people in Lublin, were speaking Polish at home versus Yiddish? Was anybody speaking Hebrew at home?
Well, it's hard to give any specific numbers. For sure, the vast majority of Jews living in Lublin in interwar period were Yiddish speakers. Yiddish was an old language, widely spoken in most parts of Poland. Many of them adopted the Polish language, especially in the late, in the interwar period, in the second half of the interwar period, mainly because of public school system. Jewish kids, some of them were attending Polish schools, so they were studying in the Polish language. So many of them were actually turning into the sphere of the Polish language. Some of them there were some Hebrew speakers in pre-war Lublin, but the Hebrew language was not it was so to say a curiosity. It was like there was a Hebrew language school, the Tarbut school in Lublin. There were some sport clubs that were trying to educate with the use of the Hebrew language. There were some institutions like scout organizations promoting the Hebrew language among kids and youth. However, it was not a a language spoken in streets. We have to also remember that a lot of Jews adopted the Russian language as a secondary language because of the Russian occupation of Poland till 1917. And well, if I may, I have an anecdote about this this linguistic diversity of pre-war Lublin Jews. Here you can see a photo showing the Corso Theater in Lublin. It was the grandest, the most exquisite theater and cinema in pre-war Lublin. Unfortunately, it was destroyed during the Second World War. So in 1931, the famous Hebrew author, also Yiddish author, but he's known as the Hebrew author Chaim Nachman Bialik, who almost got the Nobel Prize, visited Lublin he had some kind of tour. He was visiting many places in Europe, and he visited Lublin, and he gave it was a holiday in Lublin, according to the pre-war press. People were excited because he was well known. He was seen as a prophet, almost a prophet of a new era, the era of the Hebrew language. So in this theater corso, he gave a powerful and very convincing lecture about the importance of the Hebrew language. And he said, the Yiddish language is just an episode in the history of the Jewish nation. Hebrew, however, is eternal. Very powerful words. The irony is that he gave this powerful and convincing speech in Yiddish because there were no Hebrew speakers in the audience. Hebrew was still a curiosity. It was still developing in Lublin. So even though there were people who were trying to promote Hebrew, some of them were trying to promote the Polish language, like, for example, Franciszka Arnsteinowa, who was a very famous Polish poet, but she was born into a Jewish family. The Yiddish language was the language spoken by the vast majority of Jews living in Lublin, and also culture produced by, produced and consumed by Lublin Jews was a culture in the Yiddish language.
So you mentioned already a couple of different types of schools. You talked about Jewish children attending school with non-Jewish children, and also Hebrew language Tarbut school. What other possibilities were there for a Jewish child in Lublin in terms of schooling?
Well, there were two main possibilities. First of all, a Polish school, a public Polish school, and a Jewish school, a private school that had government-issued rights to teach according to Ministry of Education standards. So there were Jewish schools that were using the Polish language as the language of education. There were Hebrew language schools, and there were also Yiddish language schools, especially in Lublin, the school named after Yitzchok Leib Peretz, the very famous poet, author, one of the fathers of the modern Yiddish literature, who was also somehow affiliated with the Bund and with left-oriented Yiddishists circles.
And he was born in Zamość.
He was born in Zamość, but he spent most of his life in Warsaw. He also visited Lublin, I think in 1913. I don't remember exactly, but it was also a huge event.
So tell us more about that school. I know you have a couple of quotes from children that attended that school.
Yeah, so the Peretz School in Lublin was quite special because it had a very progressive, very interesting program. They were teaching in Yiddish, but they were also trying to make those kids sometimes from very poor districts in Lublin. Like we often mention Krawiecka Street in Lublin, the Podzamcze area, which was basically a ghetto of poverty. So they were not only trying to give them a proper education, but also uplift them, change their lives, make them believe in themselves, in their strengths and in their talents, in their civil rights also. And like I've never seen anything like that in either Polish or English literature, but there is this entire genre of poems, short stories written by famous authors like Peretz, Sholem Aleichem, and others about Yiddish-speaking schools. Like it was a huge project undertaken by generations of activists trying to uplift the Yiddish language. Because you probably know that Yiddish was perceived for many years as some kind of jargon, as some kind of broken language, as a broken German or something like that. So
my grandmother, my grandmother, who her best language was Yiddish, but she always said it wasn't really a language,
Well, that was her opinion. But today I don't have any quotes from literature. I've prepared. I translated letters written by students of Lublin Peretz School. They were published in 1937 in a newspaper called Lubliner Stimme. It was a Bundist newspaper in Lublin. So, for example, Feiga Turner from the 5th grade writes, "Our school is dear to me because children from our school like each other and our teachers are friendly towards us. I am grateful to my parents that they sent me to the Peretz School. When I was ill and was in bed, I was fantasizing. Now there is a break, now a lesson, and I was dreaming about everything, my desk at school, teachers and students, every lesson. The school year will end soon and they will give us reports. When other children will have fun during summer, I will dream about teachers and students. I will miss our school." And also a letter from Topcia Sheper, who was younger. She was in 3rd grade in 1937. "My Yiddish school, the Peretz School, is dear to me. I go there because it is dear to me. If I don't go to school, I am sad. At school, the teacher tells us many stories. In Polish schools, children beat Jews. In our school, we learn that everybody should be equal. We fight for that. That's why my school is dear to me." So, so the school, as I said, had a very progressive program. It was a very interesting and many achievements in the field of education and social work. It was also like affiliated with many other cultural institutions. Here, by the way, you can see children from Peretz School with their teachers and activists of the Jewish Central School Organization, with items prepared by kids for an exhibit, a very interesting exhibit called 1000 Years of Jews in Poland. For Polish speakers, if there are any Polish speakers among us, they can find an article by Professor Kopciowski from Lublin, Maria Curie-Skłodowska University, who was researching the subject of that exhibit. And maybe we can post a fragment from the Yiddish newspaper explaining.
I think Agata can put in the chat. Do you want to just read a couple of the items that were in the exhibit?
Yeah, maybe, because it's fascinating. So the kids from Peretz School prepared things like 8 maps showing the development of the Jewish settlement in Lublin, a series of images, photographs, graphics, and models about Jewish Lublin. What else? Documents from an old Jewish court, an image of the famous spoon used to cleanse corpses. The spoon, by the way, survived, and it was found in the late 1980s somewhere in Lublin. Today it is
a spoon, you're saying? A spoon?
Yeah, a very special ceremonial spoon used to clean corpses. What else? A scroll showing Jewish tragedies, including blood libel accusations and the massacre by the Khmelnytsky forces in Lublin. Albums showing photos of known personalities from Lublin and depictions of Lublin in Yiddish literature. A wooden model in a form of marching figurines showing Jewish workers' movement, and 2 models of the old Peretz School in Lubartowska Street and of the constructing Peretz House.
When was the Peretz School established? What year?
It was established in the early 1930s. I think it was 1931, something like that. I don't remember exactly, but in the early 1930s.
And you have a photo of the building, right?
Right. The problem with Peretz School was that I'm having some issues. Was that although the school was so interesting, that was its building, a barrack without any sanitary installations, in a very poor condition. Not a school building. It's a place where you can store broken items, not educate kids. So that's why, maybe here you can also see children from Lublin Peretz School in front of their school building. So that's why Lublin activists from the Bund and from the Central Jewish School Organization decided to build a very modern school building, the so-called Peretz House, or Volkshaus aufgenommen von Judlamet Peretz in Yiddish, People's House, named after Yitzchok Leib Peretz in Lublin.
So what was, and we should say that you've created an exhibit all about Peretz House, and when people receive their post-meeting email, we'll put a link to a short film where you can see images from that. But what was the concept? What else was going to be included here besides a school?
So the concept was to establish something like Jewish culture center, a secular culture center that would be a place where, for example, children from Morgenstern Sport Club can exercise, where Yiddish theaters can perform, where Jewish orchestras or choirs can perform and create Yiddish-based culture. But it was also meant to counter the image of Lublin as a city dominated by the yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, the famous yeshiva established by Reb Meir Shapiro. And I actually have a quote from Bela Shpiro. Maybe I can show you Bela Shpiro. She was the leader of the Bund in Lublin, a very influential figure. That's Bela Shpiro, and her husband Jakov Nissenboim, who was the editor of Lubliner Tugblatt, the biggest Yiddish newspaper in Lublin. So Bela Shpiro wrote, "We want to tell the Jewish world that there is also a different Jewish life in Lublin, embodied not by the name of Rabbi Meir Shapira, but by the name of Peretz. Therefore, we decided to name the People's House after Peretz. The People's House and the Yeshiva will become two important addresses in Lublin, and in time a clear distinction of two different Lublin currents of mental development will crystallize, and both in Poland and abroad, the one at the Shapira's Yeshiva and the one at Peretz House. We are not building the People's House because of some sort of caprice or luxury. This building is for us the most urgent need these days."
Oh. I know another initiative of the Bund, and I don't know if this is connected to Peretz House, but were these summer camps for Jewish kids?
Well, it is somehow connected with Peretz House, but it's something maybe not directly connected. It was the initiative of the Bund, and also, and it's another leader, Shloime Herschenhorn, who was a dermatologist, but also a social worker. Summer camps for poor kids, poor Jewish kids from Lublin, from Krawiecka, Jateczna, Szeroka streets. And for those of you who have been to Lublin and who recognize a huge mall located near Brama Grodzka, its name was Tarasy Zamkowe. Now its name is something like Vivo. So before the war, at that place, there was a huge open space owned by an institution called TOZ, which stands for Society for Improving the Health of the Jewish Population. And every year they were organizing their summer camps for poor kids, where they could have fun, learn something, take a bath, because we have to remember that most of them were born into extremely neglected social
environments.
Many of them lived without such luxury as bathroom or hot water or even glass in windows. So so yes, it was an extremely beautiful initiative undertaken by Herschenhorn, but also many teachers, also from Peretz School, many physicians, medicians from Lublin.
And I think you told me that also they invited non-Jewish kids to these camps.
Yes, I remember reading a short article in Lubliner Stimme, I think, the Bundist Weekly, about the invitation given to kids from a Polish scouting organization, somehow affiliated with Polish leftist political party. So they were trying to, bring together Polish kids and Jewish kids. They were trying to show them that, well, they're both human beings, and maybe they can their cooperation, coexistence can be at least a bit more developed than the existence based on conflict and hatred.
So we have a few minutes left. I want to make sure that you get to talk a little bit more about Peretz House, like how did it get built? Did it open? What happened to that building after the war?
So, well, the Peretz House was unfortunately not finished. It was scheduled to open on September 1st, 1939. And as we all know, the Second World War broke out on September 1st, 1939. So the school never started in 1939. And during the Second World War, it's important to note that during the Second World War, Peretz House was turned into a hospital for epidemic diseases. I have one document from the archive of Lublin Judenrat. It's in Polish, but it's a document saying that in October 1941, Peretz House was turned into the hospital because of the typhonic fever. I think that's the
typhoid fever or typhus.
Typhus, because of typhus epidemic. However, after the war, after Lublin was liberated, Peretz House, soon after the liberation, it became one of the first shelters in liberated Poland, shelters for the Holocaust survivors. So thousands of people escaping from still occupied territories, or people who survived in Lublin area, they were coming to Lublin and coming to Peretz House to find shelter, to find help, also financial help, but also help in search of their relatives, friends, and families. As maybe some of you know, that for half a year, Lublin was de facto capital of Poland from 1944, July 1944 to 1945. So a lot of people, because it was the seat of the new communist government, a lot of Jewish refugees were coming to Lublin. So Peretz House was the epicenter of that movements of people. However, later when Warsaw was liberated and the government moved to Warsaw, of course Lublin's importance was not Lublin was not so important anymore. So in time, Peretz House turned into something like even like a hotel. So the Jewish community was not satisfied with that, and for a very brief period of time, they organized there a Jewish school. It was a Polish language school, however, it was a school for Jewish kids. So in 1948, Peretz House fulfilled its original purpose for just a year, but it happened. In 1951, the building was given to the Polish government in strange circumstances. So since then, it has housed many public health institutions. But maybe we can actually go back to 1945. A very important, because I would like to read you something about a very important event that took place in Peretz House. It was a concert, one of the first concerts of Jewish music, Jewish poetry in liberated Lublin, a concert of Diana Blumenfeld. Maybe some of you know her. She was a popular pre-war actress, singer. She survived together with her husband Jonas Turkow. They survived in occupied Poland. And in Lublin, for example, they established Yiddish language radio programs, which was, it's a completely different topic, but it's also a wonderful story. However, in March 1945, Diana Blumenfeld gave a concert of Jewish music in Yiddish in Peretz House. And I have a quote from a Yiddish newspaper from Mexico City. So it was a thing, press from the world was writing about it. So maybe I can read the quote. The great hall of Peretz House is full of a special kind of audience. Tragic fate brought them here from every corner of Poland and Europe. Every and each of them is a real world of sorrow, a survivor and a living witness of crimes committed by bloodthirsty beasts of all time. In many cases, they are the only survivors from their families or entire Jewish communities. You can see women from Auschwitz, pale and broken youth from Lithuania, tormented Jewish girls from Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary, Jewish boys from Greece in their blue-white strip clothing, strong faces of Jewish partisans, liberated prisoners of war from France, and Jewish soldiers of the Polish army. A group of children from Majdanek is also here, the only that survived, saved at the last moment when a Russian tank rammed German truck, taking them for a slaughter. Today, a Jewish cultural event takes place at Peretz House. At the stage, the great Jewish artist Diana Blumenfeld. She and her husband, Jonas Turkow, are almost the only Jewish artists who survived in occupied Poland. When she sings, a peculiar shiver spreads over the hall. The distance between her and the audience disappears. Borders of countries disappear. Entire generations hold each other's hands, killed martyrs and hurt survivors, those killed during the war and those who continue the fight, burned fathers and grandfathers and surviving children and grandchildren. They are all here.
Wow. Thank you so much, Piotr. That was a powerful way to end this part. I'm opening it up for questions. I see there are a few questions here. So Tzvika Ruben says, Peretz is a Sephardic name, so I guess there should have been a non-Ashkenazi community also in Lublin?
No, well, Peretz is of course a Sephardic name, and Yitzchok Peretz was from a family of Sephardic roots. They came from Spain ages before. However, Peretz adopted, and his family, they adopted the Ashkenazi culture and the Yiddish language, and Peretz became one of the fathers of the Yiddish language. I've seen that there was a question or the observation about the Bund, that it was established in the late 19th century. And of course, the Bund was established in the late 19th century, but in Russia. In Poland, Bund was established in the city of Lublin. And after the war, in 1944, well, during the war, but after Lublin was liberated, the Bund was re-established also in Lublin.
Did Peretz House play any role in the 1947 reunion of Jews in Lublin?
Yes. It was still owned by the Jewish community, by the Jewish committee, actually. Some cultural events were taking place there. They were meeting there because it was a huge building. It was possible to meet there. A few hundred people came to Lublin in 1947 for the reunion. So yes.
Okay. Here's a question from Esther Luden, Halberstadt. Did the attributes the pupils made survive? I guess maybe she means did, the things for that exhibit of the 1,000 years of Jewish Lublin, did any of those?
No. Well, it's a mystery because the exhibit, it was a Poland. It was a Poland-wide exhibit. How to say that in English? So kids from many places in Poland were preparing items, and they were meant, like, the idea was to send them to Warsaw and open a huge exhibit with items from many different places in Poland. However, from what I remember, the Polish censorship or police or government decided to cancel the exhibit because from their point of view, it was promoting the communist ideology. Okay. So, and they were probably destroyed. Like, who knows if the items were in Warsaw, because the exhibit was meant to open in 1939. So if they were in Warsaw, they were probably destroyed during the destruction of Warsaw. It's
sort of like the early version of the Poland Museum,
Yes, it's amazing, and I think I would love to see a recreation of that exhibit. Of course, we have only descriptions in press and in Yiddish newspapers. However, you can imagine how creative and how beautiful it must have been.
Do we know if any of the children from the Peretz school survived?
Yes, for example, we know that Josef Freund, who was later he was the leader of the Bund in Israel, or actually a party that its name was not the Bund, however, it was a Bundist political movement in Israel. So he survived. Some of them survived. However, we have to remember that most of them were poor kids from poor families, and poor people without financial means. Well, the rate of survival among them was extremely low during the Second World War because they had no means of escaping Poland in the early weeks or days of the Second World War, or after that.
But Bella Spiro, whose quote you read, she survived, correct?
Bella Spiro was killed in mysterious circumstances. There are different stories about her death, but she was killed probably in Warsaw or in Ravensbrück. From what I know, the Nazis were trying to crush her, force her to give them names of other Bundist leaders, but she never. She was so strong that she never gave them anything, but she was killed. Her husband, Yakov Nissenbaum, was also killed. Schloime Herschenhorn survived in Russia, and after the war, he was one of the most important figures in Jewish life in Poland and the Jewish world. Also, Berish Krempel survived. I have a photo of Berish Krempel, who was also involved in the project of building Peretz House. So this Schleime Herschenhorn, Nison Plotkin, and Berish Krempel and Schleime Herschenhorn survived.
There's another question from Zvika Rubin. How about the S. Scheffer Gymnasium?
Spers Gymnasium. It was one of the first Jewish schools in Lublin, but it was a Polish language school established by the Sper family. It was it was an interesting school.
So
I don't know any details, so that I can only say that such a school existed, and it was a private school, but they had like a government issued license, so so they were not some kind of like Sunday school, but a proper normal school.
Okay, we have just a few minutes before finishing. I wanted to ask you if you could quickly tell us how you got interested in Yiddish, and then I have one final question.
Well, the Yiddish language. Well, the history of Polish Jews was written down in the Yiddish language. So there is no history of Jews without Yiddish, and well, it's a fine and very interesting language which was spoken wildly and widely in the entire Poland. It's a part of Polish heritage, so that's my answer to your question.
Okay, and so to conclude, what are there any lessons for us today from the initiatives of the Bund and this idea of Peretz House or camps?
Yes. The question is, are we interested in hearing what pre-war Bundists and builders of Peretz House are saying to us? Both Peretz House and other activities of the Bund they were dreaming of a world without racial differences, without racial or religious hatred, a world dominated by things like solidarity, things like equality, both social and economical equality. And they were not only dreaming about such a world, they were actually undertaking very concrete steps towards creating such a world. They were establishing schools with great education, schools that were uplifting kids. They were establishing summer camps where Polish and Jewish kids could meet. They were organizing various lectures, events for workers, trying to educate them about the world. So I would say that if someone is interested in changing the world into something brighter and more beautiful, the person can learn the most important question. We have to be active, we have to act, we have to do everything in our power to make a difference.
Okay, that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Piotr. That was
Thank you so much.
You really illuminated like many different aspects of Jewish Lublin, and I'm sure everybody was enriched by it. I want to also thank Agata Radkowska, who is the brainchild behind Brama Talks and was behind the scenes doing everything. And of course, you, the audience, without whom we would not be here. So thank you for attending. After this webinar, you will receive an email. If you've been with us before, you know what I'm talking about, where you're able to rate the webinar and also give comments. We read everything, and we'd really appreciate if you give us comments. And you're also invited to share with us if you have ideas about future Brama Talks, if you'd like to know, you'd like us to focus on some particular aspect of Brama Grodzka's work or Jewish Lublin. So please share those ideas. The next Brama Talks is going to be towards the end of October, after the Chagim. So for those of you who celebrate, I'll just say Shana Tova and Gmar Chatima Tova, and see you next month. Bye-bye.